whipped through Verona, took out the old Gordon School while class was in session. Two of the kids were blown out. The rest of them managed to survive under their desks and behind the piano. Two of the kids, Rudy Grevant and Marion Miller, were sucked out of the school, landed across the highway, across M, what is now M, and in a plowed field. When everything was said and done, nobody was seriously injured. And that year, the local members of the school district got busy building a new school. They ran out of money. The school district gave them $7,000, which paid for materials. But they didn't have enough for chalk and erasers and things like that in school. So the ladies of the school district got busy with a quilt. And on this quilt, they had places to put your name, which they sold, raising funds. And they managed to arrange on the quilt room for 150 names. And when they had it all assembled, the ladies again got together and they embroidered every name on that quilt, making it a lovely thing. And then they raffled off the quilt to raise more money. And some guy on the west side of Madison won it. And when he died, his son was going through this quilt. And the only name he recognized there was Charlie Miller. So he brought it out to the Miller family farming out here on the west side. And
Well, you don't want to show it.
when we had the Quaz Qui Centennial, a couple of these quilting ladies were in charge of putting on a quilt show. And they advertised for old quilts, and Charlie and Ruth came to our house with this quilt. And they hung it in the school, and it was the star of the quilt show. And when the show was over, we got it back and dutifully took it back out to Charlie and Ruth on the farm. And after last month's meeting, I got to thinking, gee, that thing is priceless. It has 150 names embroidered on it. A few names. I mentioned this to the young woman out in the front desk here one day, and she said, well, what are the names on it? And I rattled through, Himsel, Morse, Johnson, Drager, Thompson, more Himsels, Weisenflues, Johnsons, Brannan, Grubbant, Zingg, Arnold Zingg, Dragers, Newtons, Reiners, Dragers again, Yagis, I don't know how you pronounce that, J-A-G.
Yeah, Yagi.
Yagi. Okay, it goes on and on.
Laura just found her mom and her grandma here.
My grandma that I'm named after. Laura
Well,
Hansel.
this lady out there at the desk, as I'm rattling through, she said, oh, that's my family.
Yes.
And that made me think, hey, this thing is priceless, ought to belong to the Hysterical Society. And, Ruth was willing to, when I called her, I said, any idea whatever happened to that quilt? She said, it was right here in my cedar chest, and I've been hoping somebody would tell me what to do with it. So, Ruth said she would donate to the Historical Society if it's displayed somewhere, so it's protected.
Yeah.
And I don't know where that ought to be.
Senior center probably. So we have someplace, unless you want it in City Hall somewhere.
We had to put that.
You did that.
I don't
Yeah.
know
I don't
where
know.
it should
That's
be.
our idea.
It should be hung on a
Yeah.
wall, protected with a sheet of glass, or on a big table,
Yeah.
protected with a sheet of glass. You don't want everybody pawing it over,
Yeah.
looking
Yeah.
for their names.
Yeah, that's the trouble.
Big question.
Something that keeps it free
Maybe
from
if we
dust.
So
Hang on the
anyway,
wall.
Joan, it's Joan's to take care of until such time as we can find a place
Yeah.
where it can be protected, but demonstrated to the public, to see all these names of their ancestors. Then
So do you have all of the names on
I
there?
have 150 names here on
Wow,
the
you got the
list.
history there then, too.
And Ruth,
Can they hold that up so we can see some more of it?
Yeah.
I think it's all the same, except it's all just names.
It is the same.
per block, there are 5 names, all neatly embroidered.
But the embroidery is beautiful and lasts for
Whoa, yeah.
these pens that they use nowadays, permanent pens, they fade with time. Their embroidery is incredible. Who's in charge of
That's
the
what
quilt
they did mention,
expo?
Tom.
Doc, how much did they raise?
They,
Well,
You know?
it's the Madison
Ruth
Folk
does
Guild.
not know,
Yeah,
They're pretty attractive.
but it was a fundraiser,
yeah.
and for what it's worth, that's
Yeah.
it.
The day of that tornado, it was in the middle of the day, and it got just as black as night.
Yeah,
And that tornado came up in
Well,
Mount
wait.
Vernon Valley and went right through where Epic is.
Across our front lawn, I think.
And
Little kid, up by your place?
went up towards
Yeah.
the Gordon
Let's
School,
hold it
and they had
inside.
a single, it was just a square, single schoolhouse with a two sloped roof. And it took the whole ends right out of the building. And the teacher saw it coming, and she got all the kids over by the upright piano. That kept the building from collapsing and killing everybody.
another thing that Ruth included in her gifts to the society is a ledger book that starts out with the Gordon School finances, starting in 1867 and running through 1948, when I think must be when the school closed. It lists all the expenses, teachers, $40,
$40?
for a whole month.
Oh, my, no wonder.
And this goes on and on, all the way through, including the
thought grade
time
school up here,
when
you got
they were
$40 a month
rebuilding
and you
and
just
borrowing
transfer it.
money from the Bank of Verona. And they borrowed $7,000, or they had $7,000 to do the.
They pay you back, Al?
Don't remember.
I'm sure it is.
Uh-oh, lost is found.
Boy, this better be good.
One little quicker yet, also included from Ruth Miller was this booklet, Prairie Farmers Home and Garden Directory of Dane County, Wisconsin. That
Well, this is
goes to
embarrassing.
the Historic Society.
Wow.
And
Nice
I don't
stuff.
know where they're gonna put these.
Yeah, we've got it sold.
But until arrangements are made for the quilt, Joan won't give it up.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Joan.
Prairie Farm.
Yeah.
We could check, does anybody have any ideas what might be a good place to put it?
Well, it should be behind glass or something.
Yeah. It's
Okay.
glass.
Awfully good.
Some kind of a
Away
case.
from the sun, shouldn't be in the
Glass,
sun.
good to put it.
I think so. I was gonna call for it.
Plexiglass or something.
And get some information. I mean, if it's going to be kept here, then I'll see what she has to say.
A meeting room where they have other meetings.
A big one.
conferences. Yeah, a
Might
lot
be
of
good.
people would see
Yeah.
it there too.
Yeah. I think you're right, you would probably get more exposure down here than,
John,
yeah.
I would recommend that the president of this organization send a thank you note to Ruth Miller.
We will have our secretary draft one up.
203 Gilman Street, Verona.
203 Gilman Street?
Yeah, she lives right down here.
Okay. Could you do that?
I'm leaving town tomorrow, but I'll do it later.
Okay, yeah, you're good. Wait. Okay.
Battery will get-
Okay, well, thanks a lot for that, and that's really a nice piece of material. But it does bring up the same problem that we had, and we gotta be cautious of not to get too many physical things, because it's hard. They told us, for the guy up in Mount Horeb, he said, you can go down that road, and then pretty soon you gotta build a building to put it all in, and so we try and we'll make exceptions, but our goal is to try and stick to photographs, letters, things like that. So, something that we can handle in the file. But there's a bunch of other things like that. There's a band uniform way back when, so we gotta find places for this.
Oh, I want to thank
Ken
Ken
Baker's
Zingg
meal
for
pouch.
falling asleep and giving me a chance to do this.
Okay.
It was 2:30.
Any other old business or business that anybody can think of? Okay, we'll move on. Next meeting, we went through that already, it's a Wednesday, December 21st at the library.
Senior
John.
center.
Stop it.
3 o'clock.
Wow.
At the senior center at 3 o'clock. Okay.
And I promised the editor of the Verona Press that we would stay at the senior center at 3 o'clock until next May.
Okay, that's good. You got that right. That's good. Okay. So then, with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn, and then we'll have our speaker. Do I have a motion to that?
I make a motion.
Oh, motion by Don, a second by
I'll
Rob.
second it then.
All in favor? Opposed? Hearing none, motion carried, we're adjourned. Now, we'll introduce our speaker. Mr. Kenneth Zingg is going to talk, I put down here, Ken. What's this? Oh, this is a letter?
No, that's that information you wanted me to,
Oh, okay, oh.
just put it in your file.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Brand was gonna give me some stuff on, and this kinda goes with our headings or subjects of class. Okay, great. He's gonna talk about, what, cheese factories? The cheese factories or cheese makers?
This is something my Uncle Ed Eberhardt wrote about the history of the Adolf Eberhardt family, his mother and father coming to this country and settling here around Verona. So I try to condense this to a point without, to make it interesting for reading. I don't know how good a job I've done with that. I have a complete copy though to leave here for this.
Oh, okay.
So I'll just go ahead and read.
Okay, if you got any questions, why we can interject, that happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
Otherwise, then forget the question.
This is a history of the Adolf Eberhardt family and written by my Uncle Eddie Eberhardt. Having reached the age of 80, the time in life comes with interest in the past becomes more real. It is therefore that I have done some research on ancestors that have gone before. Since I am the 9th child of one Adolf Eberhardt, I have tried to find out more about his life. In doing this, I find that as far back as I seem to be able to go is the year 1815 in a small town of Mettlen, Switzerland, Cantorgal, I believe you pronounce. With this as a starting point, I will record as best I can the accomplishments and whereabouts of this very fine man who was born in 1852 and died in 1931. A special reason is that I have the greatest respect in the way he conquered the hard times that existed during his life. Going back to the point of beginning, we don't know a great deal about the early personal history of Adolf. We also don't know much formal education they had, but do find Adolf at the age of 20 deciding that he wasn't completely happy with what his area of birth had to offer after hearing about a great new country in America. He had very few things to pack or carry and was footloose and fancy-free. So he raised enough funds to take a chance on the new country. In 1872, he made the move and settled in the town of New Glarus, Wisconsin, that so many from his homeland had moved to before him. His little town of Mettlen, Switzerland seemed far away, but with so many who spoke the language in New Glarus, it was much like being at home. He did possess the ability to make cheese and soon found work in a factory, the Engen cheese factory, not many miles from New Glarus. He worked there for some time as their cheesemaker and did very well. He was liked by the farmers who sold their milk there, and his product was good with good quality. Cheese was able to pay a fair price for the milk. He stayed at that post for about 20 years, saving all the time for a plan that he had in mind. His brother Gottlieb also joined him there for some time. We might also mention here that these adventurers were checked at Ellis Island. The names were written by the clerk as they sounded to them. The name Everhart, spelled H-E-R-T, was then changed to with a D, H-E-R-D-T, and kept that way for life here. After making cheese for 20 years, he had completed the first step in his plan. He had saved by being very careful with his income, $10,000, and felt that was a lot of money in those days. So he went about his second part of his plan and traveled back to Mettlen for a visit. His time was very short because during the winter, farmers did not produce much milk and used what they had to make butter at home or sell it to stores in exchange for groceries. So Adolf was unable to have some time off. It wasn't for long, so he must hurry. In Mettlen, he found a young lady very much to his liking who was 20 years old when he was 40. Helena Merlich was a young lady who had lost her father when she was very young, and a sister was born to her after his death. My mother used to ask my grandmother how she could do that, and she said, well, we knew the families. Since times were not going as well as she would have liked at home, and Adolf convinced her to marry him and travel to America with him. He must hurry because his time was limited, and soon he must be back at his factory. She consented, so leaving her mother and sister, off they went to America and the factory to make a life for each other. It was April in 1892, and the seas were very rough, and Helena was sick the entire way. But with Adolf's loving care, she made it, and I doubt that even if she had not liked what she found here, she wouldn't have ventured back. But I am sure the thought never crossed her mind. She became very happy with the arrangements and lived a good life with much work that she loved. Since this story is written by the 9th child of the Everharts, it must be remembered that this beginning is over 100 years ago, and considering the enormous change that has come about in that time in this country, it may be difficult to understand at times. The great change in transportation, communication, and all the other inventions that have come along. Just to mention a few: electricity, highway cars, airplanes, which has turned so many things around. With all that in mind, we will try to recount the history as best as we can. We have found Adolf Eberhardt, who immigrated to the United States with very little except the clothes he wore and a very few personal items. Then bringing a bride into this new country and making a home from what was a home for a lonely cheesemaker who had many things to do, making a living rather than making a home for a wife. So they were kept very busy traveling to towns away with horse and buggy and shopping for the niceties that a woman uses to make a house home. So there was hardly time to wonder if the decision to come here was the best idea. There were many Swiss immigrants from Switzerland and Norway here that worked very well together and all seemed to be happy. When the one struck a problem, all were willing to pitch in until the problem was erased. Instead of a group of families, there were one big family all caring for the others, so in that way it wasn't impossible to get settled properly. So in this very first year at the factory, in January of 1894, a son was born to them. A very healthy baby they named Ernest. We must remember that now Adolf was nearly over 40 years old, but his mind didn't ever age with his years. His plan was first in his life to make a family happy his goal. In December of the year 1894, another son joined the family. This one they named Fred, another healthy individual who still lives today at 97 years old, after raising a wonderful family too of 10 children. So much of the information that we tell about here came from questioning Fred, who still has a sharp mind and a willing tongue. It has been of the great interest to the rest of the family to discover the things which we were too young to fully understand. We do know that the town of New Glarus was about 6 miles from the factory in which the Everharts lived. So Adolf had arrived in New Glarus in 1872, and we were not sure whether Gottlieb was with him, that's his brother, or came sometime later, but knew they were together making cheese at the factory in which Adolf had started. After they had worked together, they decided that it was a factory that would only support one family, and Gottlieb had been searching for another and found one in Kendall, Wisconsin, about 75 miles to the north. So he moved there and made cheese as a bachelor for a number of years. There he met a young lady who was willing to share his life, and they married. Gottlieb at that time was 50 years old, but his bride was a younger woman. They raised a nice family of 7 children. So getting back to Adolf and Helena, though we don't have any particulars of life in the factory, we do know that Mother didn't especially like the life on the prairie without trees. So she did plant 1 or 2 cottonwood trees that grow very fast and give shade. Mother became very proud of her trees, and we know that even now one still stands. So the couple and the 2 boys, along with the addition of 2 girls, Clara, who was born in July 1896, and Mary, who blessed them in May of 1898. So there were 4 and 2 parents who lived in the factory over the cheese, making room in the basement. In 1893 until 1900, when because of crowding and being closer to town, they decided to move to a factory near New Glarus, where they lived only 1 year. It was there that Bertha was born. It was then that the parents decided that it would be wise to move the family onto land where the children could learn to work and keep busy while Adolf could still do his job for which he was well qualified, making cheese. In 1902, they purchased 160 acres of farmland in a beautiful valley about 3 miles north of Mount Vernon, Wisconsin, which was a thriving small town containing a mill that ground wheat and rye for flour and also ground feed for the animals. These 2 farms we're going to be speaking of are right near the Big Rock, down toward Mount Vernon. The farmland was good, except that it required some wood cutting and clearing land for cultivation. There is a lovely spring-fed creek that runs near the barn and water for the livestock. The house was of logs that had been added to, but not nearly enough for the family of 7 at the time. So the first project was to remodel it, which they did. It was then that they had a nephew, a son of one of Dad's brothers in Switzerland, who had married, that came over to spend time with the Everharts. It's not clear whether they were sent for or just arrived, but were a godsend. It seems that at that time there was a great interest by the Swiss people to get to the United States. They were very engendered people and didn't at all mind hardships and hard labor. This young couple that came were that type. They were good workers, and since the Everharts were faced with an enormous task of rebuilding the house to make room for all and set up farming at the same time, as well as taking care of the children, they needed all the help they could get. They did hire a carpenter to lead the way, but much of the work was done by the help of at hand. There was also the factory to build in the basement. 2, so much land to be cleared of woods and stumps. This was a major job, using only a winch and horses after cutting the main roots to remove them. After all this trouble, the land was very productive, so it was worth all the trouble. Plus, the only fuel at that time was maybe a small amount of coal, which had to be bought, or wood that was cleared to do all the heating and making steam for the factory with which the milk was warmed to just the correct degree to making cheese. First, the original log structure had to be kept to build onto, a full basement that consisted of 3 large rooms, and one was the storage for food such as garden vegetables, apples from the orchard that were wrapped in last year's catalogs, meat of all kinds, smoked, canned, any way that could be preserved. Another large room for the furnace which heated the house and kept the basement warm enough to keep above freezing so nothing would spoil. Wood to be kept dry, and most of all the cellar for making cheese. This contained a large copper kettle to hold the milk and make the cheese, a steam boiler to heat the milk, and all the tools connected to making and stirring the milk supply while cleaning all tools as well. It somehow all did get done, and then the living quarters, which were still partially made of logs. Not being able to do away with the logs and building over them had to be done, so there was shelter for the family. The additions were then constructed and the logs covered with sheeting. Added a living room, bedroom downstairs, a kitchen, and summer kitchen and pantry. The summer kitchen was used for sorting clothes and boots which were messy from the barn and outside work. It was also used for baths in a wash tub after the water was heated on the range. In addition, a second story had to be built for the bedroom for a growing family. It would be well here to try to picture that farm in the valley. It was a beautiful setting. The house on one side of the road certainly wasn't traveled very much, and the barn on the other side. The house stood on a sloping to the east with a lovely orchard in the rear. Many large black walnut trees along the road in front. Behind the house was a flat rise to farmland on top. To the west of that, a table of flat land, and until it reached the next valley that again was downhill to another creek, and the school which the children attended. So to get to the school was about 2 miles across the farmland, or about 3 on the roadway. This was the usual way, except when the weather was very bad, and then they were hauled there by wagon or sleigh. Just past the barn, a spring-fed creek that contained good drinking water for the animals. It's actually the headwaters of the Mount Vernon Creek. This was a beautiful setting for a home and somewhat sheltered from winter winds between 2 hills. Summer were so beautiful there was a creek used for swimming and fishing. A far cry from the original factory on the prairie, where there were many wolves that would howl at night when Dad would put the whey out that was left from the cheese-making process, and would then come to drink from it after all had gone to bed. Brother Fred mentions how frightening it was to wake up and hear them when Dad would have to come in and assure him they couldn't get into the house. Fred remembers how he had a cart that he would fill with sand and play that he was threshing grain. This, however, didn't last long because he was then old enough to keep busy with the real thing of threshing grain. In those days, families worked together to do these chores from one farm to another, furnishing all the help they could. Silos were filled together and shredding corn unless it was husked by hand and fed or ground at the mill. Grain was cut with a binder, which made it into bundles and then had to be shocked by setting the bundles leaning against one another into shocks a few feet long, and then covered with a couple of bundles to keep the water off in rainstorms until it was cured. After that, it was hauled to the building and put in the stacks, so when the machine came, it could be pitched into the separator and separate the grain from the straw. The straw used to bed the animals in the barn and the grain stored in the granary. Nothing was wasted, as even loose straw had to be picked up. Much of the corn was also put in shocks and then husked by hand, and the stalks used for feed as well as bedding. With this as the lay of the land leaves a picture all the children have cherished all these years. It was very peaceful there, and the family was a community. During all this time with the building and getting the farm operation going, there were still more children added, also needed care. A daughter, Bertha, had been born at the second factory near New Glarus in the year the Everharts made cheese there. Bertha was then born in February of 1901. They were the parents and 5 children to shelter in this new home. Other additions to the family after that was Lena in March of 1903. Lena married Rudy Whitridge, and her children, Doris Waldman and Betty Zerbach and Donnie Whitridge, still live in town here. In December of 1905, Adolf in June, and that was Adolf Jr., Edward in the December of 1910, and finally Rose in March 1913. My mother was, when she was born, her dad was 61 years old. Doctors in those days had to travel with a team of horses and a buggy, so it was up to the parents to do what they could to keep the youngsters well and use the services for a doctor only when things got out of hand, which did happen a few times. Just to mention a few things that happened, Lena, as an energetic little girl, was swinging on the railing of the porch when she tipped over backwards and landed on her head on a rock wall. She was out for quite some time with what I now presume was a concussion. Rose, who was playing on the ground where she should have not been, when the horses were left to go singly into the barn, one horse whose eyesight was bad didn't see her and bumped her with a foot, and she too was out for quite some time. Bertha had a very bad case of diphtheria, which was a real killer, and all were put under quarantine for quite some time. There were just a few of these accidents. The area was deathly afraid of diphtheria at the time, and many would whip their horses as they drove past, but there weren't that many that had to go past. After the older girls, who were quite a way ahead of the younger ones, were able, they took care of the younger, so Mother had time to work, help the boys and Dad on the farm. Dad spent a great deal of time evenings going to the more trained farmers to check what type of machinery he must have. So this gives a picture of what a family of 10 and 2 parents can manage to do and make success of self-support as they did. To remind teachers of today who feel overworked, we might just mention here what a teacher of those days had to do. Besides teaching the 8th grades of their jobs, also consisted of seeing that the heating system was supplied with wood that was brought in by the farmers. The water was carried a couple blocks from the nearest farm pump, and there was no janitor. The enrollment at that time was furnished by Brother Fred, who still had a list of the pupils. And Miss Kittleson was a teacher. There were 49 students listed here. So this is where the children learned what they had to know in later life. A 2-mile walk across the farm fields, with the last section going down a steep hill into that next valley, and then across a creek to the school. There are many who didn't make it dry across that creek, but dried off as the day wore on. Some used homemade skis in winter when they would tumble and chase a dinner bucket down the hill on foot. Those were the days. Another interesting accomplishment that we must mention was that these people, aside from their very busy schedule, had decided that they must have a church in which their children might get a Christian education. The older Eberhart children went to Mount Horeb and were confirmed there in the Lutheran church. The farmers organized a group, which Adolf Eberhardt was also a charter member. They constructed a very nice church in Mount Vernon, where the preacher was required to also preach in German. It's the little church down in Mount Vernon.
Still there?
Still going. The church is still very active today, and we hope will be for years to come. In around 1909, Dad got a letter from someone in Metten, Switzerland. The letter explained that Walter, who was the son of Dad's only sister, was wandering around with no future in mind and was near 20 years old. Dad's sister had died and the father was not able to give the boy a good home. Would it be possible for Dad to loan the transportation cost to have the boy come to America and live with us? Dad considered that it would be beneficial to both to go to the bank, which had always been a great help to Dad, to have them make all the arrangements. So they picked up this Walter in Mount Horeb. He came by train. They reported that Walter was a well-built lad, but his clothes were a mess. First thing then was to get him into the general merchandise store and outfit him in shoes and overalls. Dad was to keep track of all the expense, and Walter was to work for Dad until the sum was paid off. Ernest and Fred were then only 11 and 10, and with Walter at 20 would be a big help. Around that time, a neighbor of ours approached Dad about an 80-acre farm that bordered each of their farms. This was the Monham place, and the 40 that contained a nice house was on the parcel adjoining ours, and the other 40 joined land with Lingard's farm, the other buyer. So the deal was made, and the Everharts then had 205 acres. Then another big project was to move that good house to the north of the present buildings of the Everharts and split the land into two parcels. The one with the original buildings contained 95 acres and the new farm containing 105. There was also a considerable amount of woods on that farm which must be cut to make room for more crops. Even after the house could be moved onto it, which was a move of maybe a mile, but across a creek and other obstacles. Moving the house in those days was not as simple as it would be now. It was all done on timbers with round logs between them and the house floor. To move it was done with a team of horses and a winch to pull it along. After setting up all the timbers, the horse walked in a circle to pull the house along with the use of a rope. This was a slow process, but not impossible, even across the creek, and ended up where it was intended. After the basement was done, the house was moved onto it with the only apparent damage, some cracked plaster. Now, before in this story, we left Ella Merlick in Metlin with her mother. Their father had died before she was born. Mother and her sister corresponded, and also their mother. At some time it is known that between them, after Ella was married, that she and her husband and the little girl Helen would also like to see this new country of opportunity. So they too came to America and found the Everharts on the farm near Mount Vernon. It so happened that Ella's husband was also a cheesemaker, and they found a factory just about across the road from the Malone School where the Everhart children went to school. Ella's husband was Fred Zingg. Fred Zingg would be the grandfather of Harvey and
Edmund?
Gladys.
Edmund.
They had 3 boys and 4 girls. When Ella's time would be up for delivery for a baby, mother would act as midwife and vice versa. Then the Zings decided that they too would like their children to be raised on a farm. They bought a farm just a mile north of the village of Rona. This made this exchange of midwifery a bit more difficult, as it was about 8 miles or so from the Everhart farm. Yet they made it fine, all bundled up in a sleigh in winter, sitting on a bunch of straw and with some bricks at their feet that had been warmed in the oven of the cook stove and bundled up with sideboards on the sleigh. Walter Zingg, who would be this Fred's son, was born in February when the going was rough, but mother and one of the boys made it to leave her there. Now the older girls were grown up and they could care for Adolf, who was born in June the year before. Adolf became the student of the family and graduated from the university in 1930. Yet he was the first one of the 10 who passed away early in life. He was only 35 and met his death as a major in the Air Force and died in a flaming plane crash in Georgia where he was training. Another family from Switzerland who came here and raised a family. I don't know the connection was between those two families. I do know they were very good friends and that Fred Ingwald, the husband, took over a blacksmith shop in Verona. Dad spent much of his time in retirement at that shop. This is back to the farm. So things went quite well with all the working there. Things went quite well with all the working there who were old enough to help. Walter Wellauer, who stayed on until not only his debt was paid off, but also Dad bought for him a horse and buggy with which he could get around. That debt also was paid, and Walter stayed on until Fred decided to move to New York, taking along his cattle and machinery with him, at which time Walter became quite a big help to him. Moving at that time by train was no simple matter. Walter Wallauer and Fred Eberhardt and then another family by the name of Weil all went to New York to farm. Dad decided that with cars just beginning popular, he too would like to have one. Ernest was a principal driver, but it was rarely used at night because of the many problems. The lights were fueled by gas of sorts and had to be ignited with a match. They too would blow out in the wind, and the driver always carried along a kerosene lantern to relight them. Tires were also a major problem, as seldom it was possible to travel far without a flat tire. This then must be removed from the rim, patched, pumped up, and replaced. In case of a blowout, the hole in the casing must be covered with a boot. It was far easier to use the horses and buggy than go through all that at night. There also were no paved roads, so after the rain, the things offered too much trouble. The car also had a rag top and side curtains that would flop in the wind. It never entered the mind to use the thing in winter, as then the radiator must be drained and the tires stored in the basement until spring, and the roads were again in shape to drive on. Dad, in spite of having some trouble with the language, anything but a backward farmer. Things were kept neat, and he learned so many of the American ways from his neighbors, as he was well liked and respected. At one point, he was contacted to try a new seed, alfalfa, that was being developed. There was a flat field top across the valley which seemed like in a field that contained lime shale. And it was suggested that Dad try the seed on that piece because the seed was good in sweet soil. He seeded it there and got a terrific crop of real fine hay. Many farmers from around quite a way heard of this crop, came to see it. All were impressed, and the crop was to be a high protein crop and good feed for milking cattle. Dad was not one who would doubt to try try something new and was well rewarded with that experience. Being one who didn't doubt a new thing just because it was new, like a car, he was always ready for something he didn't understand. Another example of that is that the Flanders, which is his old car, seemed in time to leave many things to be desired in a car. This brought about buying a better one at that time. I don't remember the model date on the car, but it did have so many new things. A storage battery and self-starter, though it did contain a crank and case. Also lights electric that could be turned on with the pull of a switch. It was a 7-passenger Buick with all real leather seats. Behind the front seat, folded against the seat back, were 2 pull-down seats that were very comfortable. Still some tire trouble, and still rag-top and side curtains. We were then a happy family, and the language at home was always Swiss. His dad was more comfortable with it than English. He had been in this country long enough, but alone in the factory with many Swiss people in the area, that it was an easy way to converse. As the older children learned in school, more English crept into the home. We always, until he died, spoke to Dad in Swiss. Mother took to the language faster as she had been so much younger when she arrived, and all the children spoke to her in English. She spoke without a brogue. So now I am sure many interesting things have been missed, but many memories stay clear in many of our minds. So came the years of 1918 when Ernest went into the army and was sent to Germany. There he had a very rough time as a doughboy with very little equipment and sleeping in mud holes with diet that had to be ignored. Also gas that was used by the Germans, some of which bothered him for a long time. Another thing was what they called shell-shocked, which for the rest of his life, whenever he heard a noise from behind, would make him fly into the air. This also became a hindrance as they received a job as a street conductor, and the other fellows thought it was funny to see him jump. He had a money changer in his hand at one point, and when the sound came unexpectedly, he did jump, and the changer flew, and he was discharged, because they said it was dangerous to keep him. Also, Ernest had a very bad case of arthritis from that kind of living left to him for his entire life. He farmed the rest of his life in the northern part of the state, which was up near Chippewa Falls. So Ernest was gone, and Fred married and moved to the other farm. There he farmed for a short time when approached by an agent from the state of New York who was searching for young Swiss farmers and offered a special deal if they would move there and settle. Dad at the time sold the family farm and moved to the village of Rona. There he rented a house for 1 year, and then he heard of a very nice home that was for sale. Fred then decided to accept the offer from New York and moved his cattle and machinery by train to Auburn, New York. They moved all this by train, with Fred and Walter still with him, taking care of the livestock with milking and feed and water. It was a rough trip, as the water in some of the stops would be frozen, and much improvising to get these cattle through when they did. So into the new home in Verona. This house is still being lived in over by the elementary school. It's where Harold Johnson lived in that house. So into the new home in Verona, a block from the grade and high school, was quite an experience for kids who had seldom been to town, much less lived there. The grade school was in construction at that time, and we had our first year at the modern Woodman Hall. The home in town consisted of plenty of bedrooms for all and 4 large city lots. We had a well right in back of the house and even a bathroom. An outhouse built into the corner of the barn, which was always used unless we were sick, when we could use the bathroom. A small stove in the basement which heated the water for the bath. It was truly a modern home for the times with gas lights that were about as bright as electric, which was later built in by running the wires through the gas pipes. Also a gas stove, which was also connected to the gas tank in a pit outside of the home for supply. A large container in the basement which was raised from the floor with a hand-powered winch to the ceiling every so often by hand. That furnished pressure to drive the gas into the appliances. The house was very modern for the time and all enjoyed living there. Dad and Mother both ended their lives there. I might here mention too that the gas was brought in large 50-gallon drums that came by freight and was run into the underground supply with a hose. The area was so big with the 4 lots was used for garden, all worked by hand. The lot beside the house was all garden for vegetables to feed what was left of the children. There were 5 still at home and the parents, which made quite a tableful. The lots in back were used all for potatoes. There were times that a farmer would plow the ground and Dad did all the work after that with a hoe. They lived all the time from these gardens. I think they had all their food. Later on here, there's an article about the basement and where they stored all the potatoes and canned all their meat and all their vegetables.
How much more you got there, Ken?
Not much.
Oh, okay.
The area being so built with the 4 lots, I guess I read that one. As I remember at the time, he found this home that was a Sears Roebuck built house. Many were sold at the time with all lumber marked and numbered, so there was no sawing. As I remember, the owner had run into some tight financial problems and wanted to clear it up by selling. I believe the price was something around $6,000. Since we're a family that had been raised in a rural area on a lovely farm in a house that had been remodeled from a longhouse, and moving into town that we'd seen little of in the past, I would mention that it was quite a change. We must remember that the population of Rona at that time was under 600 souls, and there was no such thing as city, water, sewer, or very few paved streets. No electric lights or street lights. The schools were not large, but as I mentioned, the grade school was being built that was quite modern. There were 3 classrooms and a gym with a stage to play basketball. Central heating system and a janitor who took care of the place. As mentioned, the house was fairly new in a small barn that had room for 2 cars, another room for a couple of horses, an area in which we raised rabbits. A well with a pump outside from the kitchen door where we pumped the water for cooking and drinking. A sink with running water with a cistern that was run with a pressure tank in the basement.
Is that house still there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's 300 South
On
Marietta.
Church Street.
On
Right
Church?
on the corner of Church Street,
Right in front
Marietta.
of Church Street and
Marietta, South Marietta.
on the southwest corner.
I think at this time I would also like to add some of the other things I had slipped up on before. I must mention here that Dad did enjoy a bit of hard liquor once in a while, and he had a few other Swiss people too get together as probation was on in this country. These people would pass around a still and make their own alcohol. We lived in town while most of the others lived on farms and had no problems with neighbors. We could detect that smell when we came home from school though, and knew where it came from. Also, a neighbor on each side of that house were members of temperance unions, but were good people and I'm sure didn't mind it at all when the new farmers rubbed to, as long as they just kept it for themselves. Rose always objected to me telling this story, but as long as Dad wanted it, no one ever tried to stop him, as it was a very seldom operation. My mother, to her dying day, says that is not a true story. This is just one more thing that I mentioned about how much the grandchildren enjoyed visiting that house. One especially was Ann's daughter, Carol, who was so enthused with the many things she enjoyed that now many years later, and Carol, a grandmother in her own right, has spent many days to build an exact model to scale of that house. I feel in this history which I have done for my own enjoyment, since I have now been in retirement for a number of years. I know that I have missed many things which I know should have been mentioned to give a more complete picture, but if this inspires any of the present young to record their ancestors' activities, it would have been well worth passing around. The pleasure that I got from recording this work has kept me entertained over a period of years. At this point, I will end my version of the lives of the close association of one or two wonderful people. I am sure that they gave all their energy and knowledge to make life better for many people aside from themselves. Times were very different from what they are as this is being finished. I wouldn't try to list the changes from horse and buggy for transportation to setting a car and placing it on the moon. I've enjoyed remembering and putting on paper these things which cover from 1852 to the present 1998. God has been most kind to allow me to the energy and knowledge to copy this for anyone that would like to see what this period of time covers. Sometimes good, while some were very hard. At any rate, we have been allowed to cover them. One special final note about two people whose ages were 20 years apart from a foreign land. I don't believe they ever argued, certainly not before their children. Mother at times might get a little steamed up over some little things, so when Dad saw that coming, he would quietly put on his cap and slowly find something to do outside until she would recover from it.
Some things
They
never
did
change.
discuss things quietly, and he usually had the final decision, so both were satisfied. A lesson that we might all learn from all other marriages. This is a complete copy.
Oh, you got a copy of it, oh, great. That was really good.